so moving on. So since height is our favorite trait, we have a nice picture of height. And so what we have on here is we have a child's height, and then this is the mid-parent height. So essentially you just take your two parents, average their height, and you plot it there. And what you can see is that the child's height, this is like, you know, a regression or a correlation line, I'm not sure which, but it's pretty much the same thing. You can see that the child's height is related to the parent's height, and that's because for height, a lot of our genetics influences how tall we are. And so if our parents are both tall, we tend to be tall, and if our parents are both short, we tend to be short. And so we call this heritable. If there's a complex phenotype that you kind of look like your parents on, a lot of times we suspect that that has a genetic component, not always, but oftentimes it has a genetic component. And as geneticists, we're really interested in understanding what that is. However, in this case, we can kind of actually think about height as being broken into the genetics from your father and the genetics from your mother. And so the reason that most of you are probably a little bit shorter than your tall parent and a little bit taller than your short parent is because you get half of the genetics from one and then half of the genetics from the other, and so that kind of averages out, so you get some halfway point between what their genetics contributed to their height. All right, so here's a great example of short people and tall people. This is Danny DeVito and Arnold Schwarzenegger. And so this is not a HIPAA violation. I, in fact, made up these genotypes. But we can see that here, Danny DeVito, this is his genome at the locations he has these of these SNPs. And you can see that 3 of his 4 variants that he has are all decreasing height. So this A has like no effect on height, but this G makes you a little taller. And here the T makes you a little shorter, and these 2 C's both make you a little shorter. Whereas for Arnold Schwarzenegger, he has both the height increasing variants, only 1 shortening variant, and then 2 of these height increasing variants. So this would be like their genetic component. However, there's also this environmental component, so possibly they eat differently, and that has made Arnold Schwarzenegger like taller. Maybe it didn't, maybe it did. I don't really know. As a geneticist, I don't care too much about these, which I will discuss more later. But it's also possible that they exercise differently, and if they're exercising differently, that might also have an effect. So all these other things you can do that you kind of have control over are essentially the environment. Maybe you don't have control over them, but the things that are like not your genetics are all environment. So here's kind of my, off the top of my head, list of some environmental effects that people measure a lot. So there's exercise, diet and nutrition, race and ethnicity. And for this one, I want to say it's not necessarily that your race will make you taller or shorter or smarter or whatever, but rather possibly because of your race, you have different amounts of discrimination in your life or something like that, and that will in turn affect. So the problem with these environmental effects is they're highly correlated to each other. And so the fact that you measure one thing, like what's a person's race, doesn't actually mean that race has anything to do with your trait, other than that race is correlated with something else that does. So the problem with the environment is correlation isn't causation. However, we can also measure a bunch of these things. We just don't ever really like to put interpretations onto what the meaning is if we ever observe associations with these things. But things like sex and gender, socioeconomic status, it's like socioeconomic status, probably highly correlated with your nutrition growing up. Your parental education, kindergarten attendance, access to medical care, access to opportunity, distance to major cities, all of these things can affect your phenotypes in ways that are hard to measure and figure out. And so, as geneticists, I will show you our workaround to this in a little bit. But first of all, let's talk more about this genetics, because it's what I love. So, when we actually have a complex phenotype, we can have different models for how these phenotypes arise. And this is one model that we know and love in our field because it's statistically easy to interpret and it's tractable on a computer. and I will tell you more about it. So basically the idea of this model is you have some phenotype, like height, there's some mean population value mu, and then there's all of those environmental effects that we don't really know how they work. We're just going to shove into this one E here at the end for the environment. And then
it's also like the error, so like...
In the model, it's E for environment. We a lot of times we'll use an epsilon at the end for like the error from a regression. But yeah, people will use E and epsilon kind of interchangeably. I think I got it right by putting an E here.
No, I think you're right.
Yeah.
Sorry.
But then the cool part is what goes on between the environment and the population mean. So how this writes out is this G1 is saying this is the genetics that this person has at like the first SNP that we're looking at. And this is the genetics at the second SNP, third SNP, and nth SNP. Almost all the time, when we count how many SNPs there are in a study or anything like that, we say there's M. M is our favorite variable to just be like the number of SNPs is M, whereas the number of people in a study is N. So you will see N and M all the time. And then beta 1, beta 2, 3, and beta M, these are the effects of those SNPs. So if we want to fill those in, so we could say, hey, this first SNP up here, if you have it, or its effect is 0.2. So it'll increase your height by 0.2, say, inches, whatever units are up here. The second SNP, if you have it, will decrease your height by 0.1. The third SNP increases by 0.3. The M SNP decreases by 0.2. So let's look at Danny DeVito. So over here, this G, that's from that genotype matrix that we spoke about in the beginning. So it's the number of alternate alleles an individual has. So here, the red ones are the alternate alleles. So Danny DeVito has one alternate allele. So whatever his mean height was of the population, this allele is going to increase his height by 0.2. Then he's got one of these T's, so this will decrease it by 0.1. He doesn't carry any alternate alleles at the third SNP position, so that one's just going to get a 0. So there's going to be no change there. And then he carries both the C alternate alleles, so it's going to decrease there. So in general, his phenotype is going to be whatever the population mean is, plus this like sum total of all these genetic effects, plus this environmental, plus the environmental effect. So if we look at Arnold Schwarzenegger, very similar. It's the exact same effect sizes because effect sizes don't change, only the genetics will change. So you can see here he has both the height increasing, only one of the height decreasing, both of this increasing, and none of this decreasing. So his is the population mean plus 0.9. So you can see from his genetics, he's a lot taller than Danny DeVito would be if we just look at genetics. However, we don't really know what the environment's going to do. So it could be that like awful things happen to Arnold Schwarzenegger. He ends up being very short just because,
he's starved as a child.
He's starved as a child. Probably isn't what happened to him. Probably he was very well fed as a child, but the environmental component, we don't really know what that is. So all we can see from the genetics is kind of what the genetic component would be.